this isn't just a book you read and go, it was an interesting book, but I'm hoping that this really becomes a permanent part of the decision-making grid for many, many, many people, as it has for me, as I've endeavored to let that be the reality for my kids. All three of my kids are in their 20s. When we talk about these questions, I mean, they are deeply ingrained in the hearts and minds of my own children. So this is a life message for me, and I hope it becomes a life message for a lot of other people.
Welcome to Grow Think Tank. This is the one and only place where you will get insight from the founders and the CEOs of the fastest growing privately held companies. I am the host. My name is Gene Hammett. I help leaders and their teams navigate the defining moments of their growth. Are you ready to grow?
What if you had a better framework for making decisions that helped you make the best decision you could possibly make? Well, today we're going to give you the 5 questions to make better decisions. Before we get there, I want to talk to you about decision making. As a leader, you're probably faced with making decisions all the time. You have to make decisions that may not be life or death per se, but they do determine the direction that your company is going to go. They're going to determine who you bring along in that journey, as in who you hire and who you partner with. But those big questions are also going to be about how you lead others to be more confident and courageous in their decision making. So, wouldn't it be great to have 5 questions to make you better at decision making? So without further ado, we have the author of the book that's just coming out, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. Andy Stanley is the author of this book, and he is someone I've admired for many, many, many years, over 15. He is the pastor of my church. He is an incredible communicator, one of the best professional speakers I've ever seen. I'm not sure if you even call him professional, but Andy has made an impact on my life and many, many others through his work. Now, this book is just one of 20 books that he has, but today we're focused on Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. He's going to give you the 5 questions to make you better at making decisions. One of the things I like about this podcast was not only does it give you the 5 questions, but he also talks about the context of why decision making is such an important, where things go wrong. Really understanding where they go wrong and how we get in the way is the key to making better decisions, because that's where you know that it's about you, not just about the world around you. So don't be a victim, but really take care to really focus on how you can make better decisions so that you can live the life you want, impact the others around you, and lead a life worth living. If you haven't already checked out some of the resources on my website, genehammett.com, to be a better leader, to create a stronger culture, we have a lot of things that are free there for you. One of them recently that we love to share with you is 5 things visionaries get right. If you're a visionary leader and you want to get these things right, then make sure you go to genehammett.com and download it now. When you think about leadership, I want you to think about this podcast. And when you think about decision making, I want you to think about our guest today, Andy Stanley. Andy, how are you?
I'm doing great, Gene. Thanks for allowing me to crash your podcast. So excited about this.
Well, you've been on my target list. We've been trying to get you on the show for years. We've had a podcast for 6 years, serving leaders and talking about things like culture. And your leadership podcast is one of my favorites out there, period.
Well, thank you.
Well, we've got you on here because you've written a new book, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. Yep. I always ask leaders about, why did you have to write this book? Because it's not easy to write a book.
So you want to know why I wrote this one?
Yep.
Well, every time I write a book, I think I've written like 23 or 5 books. I don't know. And every time I write a book, I think that's it. I'm done. That's my last book, because it is not a casual endeavor. I do it on my own time. It's not part of my day job. But I wrote this book because through the years, I've been doing, ministry and leadership development and been with all kinds of people for years and years and years. And one of the things that breaks my heart, honestly, and I talk about this in the book, one of the things that breaks my heart is watching people make decisions that undermine their own success, because life is tough enough. Culture is tough enough on business, on any of us who are trying to accomplish anything, change anything. So the last thing we need to do is make decisions that undermine our own endeavors, our own success. And I learned a long time ago, really through my dad, that there is a really important correlation between the questions we ask and the decisions we make. And the reason everybody knows this is true is because we've all made a decision that turned out to be a bad decision. And we say out loud or to ourselves, I should have asked more questions. And so there's an extremely important correlation between the questions we ask and the decisions we make. So this book is basically, hey, here's 5 questions. And if you'll just pause and ask yourself these 5 questions, you are going to make a better decision and you're going to have fewer regrets personally, in the marketplace, in the community, just wherever there's, a somewhat major decision to be made. If we just stop and ask the right questions. And these are questions I've learned from other people. These are questions I've developed in my own life. And these are questions, honestly, I've taught my children. And I say to parents and grandparents all the time, you should get this book and at least just, either read these chapters to your kids and grandkids or do what we used to do. We used to pay our kids to read certain things or to listen to certain podcasts because, this is just really practical information that I've brought together in a kind of a bite-sized book. So that's the reason behind the book.
I'll go a step further on that. One of my sons, or I only have one son, but we want him to read the books, but we actually pay him to read them and give a book report, and he has to do it orally.
Oh, well, Sandra used to make our kids read and then write out 2 or 3 statements, depending on how old they were. But yeah, make sure they actually digested some of it. So that's a great idea.
Well, we're going to get into those 5 questions, but I want to start here first. Describe some of the things that sabotage our decision-making.
Well, your audience will appreciate this. Isn't it true that we may not be able to sell anybody else on anything, but we are all crazy good salespeople when it comes to selling ourselves on bad ideas. In fact, as soon as there's any desire for something, a thing or a relationship or a person, an event, an experience, we just go to work selling ourselves. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this: you rarely have to sell yourself on a good idea. The moment you sense that you are beginning to sell yourself, that is not a green light. That is for sure a yellow light and probably a red light. So one of the things that we get in trouble over in terms of our decision making is we're just such good salespeople. In fact, another little exercise I have in the book is I say, imagine being in a retail establishment and the salesperson begins to say to you out loud the things you say to yourself in your head. You would be so offended. Like, imagine a salesperson saying, well, look, if you get home and don't like it, you can just give it away. I mean, who would say that, right? But we tell ourselves these things, or, it's going to work out, or yeah, it's just like the one I already have, but this is a newer version. Again, where we sell ourselves. So one of the things we talk about in the book is how to stop listening to that internal salesperson. And again, these 5 questions bring some clarity to that whole process that we all struggle with.
So Andy, we've all made some bad decisions. I've made some big ones, some things that you have helped me with being the pastor of the church I attend. But why is it so difficult to learn from the bad decisions that we've made?
Well, because we think that experience is going to make us wiser, but unfortunately, experience often just creates ruts. And again, we also confuse the idea that, and this is a big deal, knowing the difference between right and wrong or good and bad decision is somehow going to influence what we actually do. And that is just not the case. Otherwise, we would all eat right and we would all exercise. So knowledge is not the problem. It takes more than knowing the right thing to do or even knowing the right decision to make to get us to actually cross the line and make the decision. So consequently, it's a far more complex process decision making is than we acknowledge. So consequently, we need some help from the outside. And those of you, and the folks in your podcast audience, they know this. The decisions they've made where they have had the courage to invite outside voices in, even contrarians into the process, they look back and they just made more informed decisions because that was, in a sense, a way of asking for more information, asking questions. So one of the things I say in the book is like, hey, instead of somebody else having to come along and ask you tough questions, I'm just going to give you the questions ahead of time. And if you got just a little bit of discipline to pause mid-decision to ask the question, you're just going to make better decisions.
Now, hold on for a second. Andy just said experience creates ruts. What I think he means by that is just because we live a life and we have all this experience, sometimes we get in a rut and we do the same things over and over. And it helps to understand that if you're in a rut, that you can actually get out of a rut, but you have to be intentional. You have to decide not to take the dessert, or you have to decide to handle a leadership challenge differently, because doing it the way you've always done it could be in a rut. One of the ways this plays out in my life as a leader is I wasn't really sure about how to lead people. I solved the problems for them instead of letting them solve them for themselves. And over time, I got worn out, but they never got better at solving the problems. It took me letting go of that. It took me actually getting a coach and learning to let go of that. So I share this with you today to just add a little bit of commentary to what Andy said about experience creates ruts. Now back to Andy. I did want to ask you about those questions, but one last thing before we get there. You've talked about the stories that really define our lives, and these decisions lead into those stories. So, what is it about the decisions that we make that really shape who we are and how we actually show up for the world?
Well, basically, if you think about it, our decisions are really like the steering wheel of our life, or the joystick, or the trackpad, or whatever device you want to use. That our decisions are how we steer our life, and our life is basically the sum of the decisions we've made and our responses to decisions other people have made about us, which, by the way, are also our decisions. So it's, we got to stay away from the victim card, because, people make decisions that impact us all the time, and we choose how we respond to those decisions. So our decisions determine the direction and the quality of our lives. This is the steering wheel for our future. And when we begin to picture it that way, and we begin to connect the dots of today's decisions, tomorrow's experiences, today's decisions, tomorrow's health, today's decisions, tomorrow's relationships, then we realize, oh yeah, this is going somewhere. Life isn't disconnected. All these dots connect, and they're connected primarily by our decisions.
You shared inside the book some of the stories that really kind of shaped your life. One of them being, how you chose the colleges that you went to and whatnot, and the experience you had with your father. But I would love to ask you right now, because we're talking to Andy Stanley about better decisions, fewer regrets. What are the 5 questions that you offer as a filter that allows us to make better decisions?
Yeah, and that's exactly what these are. These are our decision-making filter. And before I give the specifics, for some people, this is a new concept. They think, well, I don't really have a decision-making filter. Oh, yes, you do. All of us have a decision-making filter. The problem is, if you don't know what it is, you don't know if it's any good. We intuitively ask ourselves, am I going to like this? Will this make me happy? Will anybody find out? Am I going to be able to control the outcome? So we constantly are asking ourselves sort of the same questions, but they're not necessarily the best questions. So adding some new questions to an existing list of questions, because I guarantee everybody listening, watching, you have some sort of decision-making grid. And so this book is essentially something I say in the book, I'd like for you to add these 5 questions to the decision-making grid. The first question is, why? The first question is, why am I doing this? Really? And the really part's the most important part of the question. Why am I doing this? Really, this is the self-leadership question. As we all know, especially the leaders, and you have so many leaders that are a part of your tribe, the most difficult person in the world to lead is always the person in the mirror, because we're so convincing. And again, it goes back to that internal salesperson. So when you're making any kind of important decision, to look in the mirror and to say it out loud, why am I doing this? Really? Why am I going? Really? Why did I call her back? Really? Why am I leasing this? Really? I know what I've convinced my husband, I've convinced my wife, I've convinced myself, but why am I doing this really? And in the book, over and over, I say, look, you don't have to act on your answers to these questions, but you at least owe it to yourself to know and acknowledge the answer to the question. Why am I doing this really? Why am I wearing this really? Why am I staying late? Really, just being honest with ourselves. In business, you can't lead a liar. We fire a liar, right? And as long as you're lying to yourself, you can't lead yourself well. So in the book, I say, hey, look, it's time to fire the liar and be honest with yourself. So that's the first one.
Let me break in here for a second. Andy talked about in this question about self-leadership. Well, another way to say that is you've got to lead by example. You have to be the leader that you expect of your people. This is not a place where you can say one thing and do another, and you expect there to be full alignment across the team and the culture. Because when you have self-leadership, you have integrity, you have honesty, transparency. All of those things are necessary for you to be the kind of leader that you probably want to be. If you want to be a visionary leader, you've got to have strong self-leadership. Back to Andy.
Second question, and this is one of the questions that I taught my kids early, is what story do you want to tell? What story do you want to tell? Because think about it. Every decision you make becomes a permanent part of the story of your life. And we don't think in terms of story. And that's the problem. We think in terms of isolated decisions, isolated events. But every single decision becomes a permanent story. A permanent part of your life becomes a permanent part of your story. So the question to ask is, what story do I want to tell? I have a good friend, I tell the story in the book, who very successful guy, went through just a horrible divorce. And as is the case, so oftentimes it became about money. And we had lots of conversations, and early on in the process, because this was going to be a long, drawn out, expensive process, I said, and I'll try not to say his name. I said, look, here's how to tell how you're doing, and here's how to process this. One day, believe it or not, this whole long, drawn out, emotional, difficult situation is going to be nothing more than a story that you tell. This is just going to be a story that you tell. At some point, this is all in the past. It's just a story that you tell. What story do you want to tell? And you get to decide day by day whether or not you're going to tell a good story. And so throughout this 1.5 year ordeal, every once in a while, I would get a text. And here's what he would text me: Andy, I can still tell my whole story. And he just kept that front and center. So what story do you want to tell? Because whatever you're going through right now, whatever it is, eventually it's nothing but a story that you tell. And you get to choose whether or not it's a good story.
Now, hold on a second again. Andy just talked about your story. Now, as a leader, you want to make sure that you're intentional about the story that you're creating. In the book, he talks about how decision-making is what really defines the way we live our life, which is the story that we want to tell to others. So when you're leading others, you want to think about the story that they're writing. Maybe you can even ask questions about, what story does this relate to in your life? Or let me give you another example. When you're talking to an employee, how is what they're doing, whether they're showing up late all the time or they're not turning in their reports on time or whatever it is, ask them the question is this a story that you want to tell? And the answer probably will be no. They want to play at a higher level. They want a level of excellence. And that's the story they want to tell. Well, you can actually have a conversation around what story that they want to create in their life. So that's another example of how you can use this beyond just leading yourself and making better decisions for you. Back to Andy.
Third question is the conscience question. And it's, is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? Here's why this is important. Oftentimes, all the information lines up on the positive side of the ledger in terms of making a decision, all the logical things. Yes, I need to do this. And then just before you pull the trigger, or as you're approaching the day when you have to make the decision, there's something on the inside that's kind of like a hesitation, and it doesn't make any sense. And because it doesn't make any sense, we have a tendency not to pay attention to it. So the third question is there a tension, regardless of what everybody else is saying, everybody else is going, how everybody else handles this, processes this? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? And here's what those of us who've lived long enough either already know or figure out. Oftentimes that tension, even though it doesn't have any information around it initially, when we pause and pay attention to that tension, generally things begin to surface. And if we're open, there's new information to be discovered. But that there's this thing on the inside of us, part of our conscience, that's just like a red flag. It's just an internal hesitation. And it's easy to talk ourselves over and through it, because as soon as we switch on the logical part of our, decision-making process, there's not a lot of reason. But I've learned the hard way, and I bet everybody watching and listening has learned the hard way at some point. It's good to pay attention to that tension. So the third question is there a tension that deserves my attention? The fourth question is the one my dad raised me on and I raised my kids on. What is the wise thing to do? What is the wise thing to do? Not what is the right thing to do. it's bigger than that. What is the wise thing to do? We talk about this question from 3 angles in light of my past experience, my current circumstances, my future hopes and dreams. What is the wise thing to do? And then the fifth question is the relationship question. This is the question where there's not necessarily a payoff. In fact, this question may just cost you, and it's a relationship question. And the question is, what does love require of me? What does love require of me? So those are the 5 questions. And then the book is full of extra information. And I was talking to somebody who said, well, Andy, if you just give me the 5 questions, I don't need to read the book. And I said, no, see, you're about to make that mistake again. Knowing and doing are completely different things. Knowing and doing, there's no necessary correlation. So I've tried to tease out these 5 questions in the book, again, so they'll become a permanent part of the decision-making grid.
Love the questions. And I do, agree with you that just knowing the questions is not enough. When I was reading through the book, I was filtering through some of the things I had made, and I wish I had them on those decisions that I sort of regret. It would have slowed me down a little bit. Maybe I would have made a different decision that would have put me in a different place. You talk a lot about the Bible and God in this book, and I think it's an excellent way to do it because you talk about your personal stories. You talk about some of the stories of friends and people that are around you, but also you bring in some of the history because you are one of the most admired pastors and ministers that I know of. But you talk about why does seeking God's will for your life lead to a deeper peace? And I know that has to do with the decision making, but why was that such a big deal for you to
Yeah, well, sort of the backdrop of that. My dad's a pastor, and one of the he may have been a little bit too early on this, but one of his big things growing up is, Andy, you need to discover God's will for your life, that God has a plan for your life and you need to discover it. And once you discover it, then you need to follow through and do it. So, what is God's will for your life? And that's such a big, overwhelming, like, how am I supposed to figure that out? Is God going to speak to me? In fact, in the book, I tell kind of a humorous story of, there's a story in the Bible about God, talking to a little kid. My dad would tell me this story and say, if God ever speaks to you, and I'm thinking, no, I don't really want to hear a voice. I don't really want to hear that directly from God. But I do, if God has a plan for me, I certainly want to know what it is. And what I've discovered through the years is simply this, that these 5 questions, and there may be more, but these 5 questions in particular, establish a direction and a pattern, and again, a grid for decision-making that will line up with whatever it is that God has equipped you and called you to do, whether it's in the marketplace, whether it's in the community, whether it's in the world, whether it's volunteering, whatever it might be, that good decisions, again, they're the steering wheel, will direct you in the path that you're to go. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding, right? In all your ways, acknowledge him. And these 5 questions, whether you're a Christian or just a general theist, or maybe you don't even have any kind of formalized religious, belief system, so to speak. You're not a part of a gang or a tribe or a group. The sense that there's something for you and there's something bigger than perhaps just living for yourself. These 5 questions, again, they form the grid system through which you make better decisions. You have fewer regrets, and consequently, you're just going to live a richer life. So there's definitely a correlation between the spiritual side of this for me as a Christian and these 5 very practical questions that, of course, anybody can ask, whether there's any kind of spiritual interest or not.
One last time breaking in here. If you don't know about our YouTube channel, I want you to go ahead and check that out. We have some content on the YouTube channel that we don't have anywhere else. So if you want to be a visionary leader, you want to create a competitive advantage culture, you want to grow your company beyond where it is today, then you want to make sure you check out the YouTube channel. Just go to genehammett.com/YouTube. When you think about leadership and you think about growth, think about Growth Think Tank. Now back to the interview. Well, I'm talking here with Andy Stanley. His new book coming out, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, is in bookstores now. And is there one last thing that you kind of want to leave the audience with about these 5 questions for better decision making?
Yeah, I would just encourage people to, obviously I'd love for people to read the book, but to just take the 5 questions and put them on a card somewhere and just keep them in front of you in a desk drawer, on your mirror, or wherever, on your dashboard for a while. So that, again, this isn't just a book you read and go, it was an interesting book, but I'm hoping that this really becomes a permanent part of the decision-making grid for many, many, many people, as it has for me, as I've endeavored to let that be the reality for my kids. All three of my kids are in their 20s. When we talk about these questions, I mean, they are deeply ingrained in the hearts and minds of my own children. So this is a life message for me, and I hope it becomes a life message for a lot of other people.
Andy, I want to appreciate you for being here on the podcast. Grow Think Tank is the place where founders and leaders learn and grow. And so I appreciate you sharing your wisdom here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Well, this wraps up a great interview with Andy Stanley to talk about your decision-making process and having a framework that you know that works going into a big decision or even small decisions will help you make better decisions with fewer regrets. If you're a leader and you want to grow to the next level, make sure you stay tuned in to more episodes from Grow Think Tank. I'm here to be an executive coach, to be a guide to you if you need it, some objective advice. Sometimes it's coaching, but that's what I do. So thanks for tuning in here to Grow Think Tank. As always, lead with courage. We'll see you next time.